This morning we're changing tack a little. Yesterday was really about strategy and the sort of broad brush picture of how Australia might go about structuring a future submarine program. This morning we're going to start off with the industrial and economic viewpoints. We've got a very distinguished panel here with us. Stephen Ludlam, the CEO of ASPI, is going to kick off. Then my colleague Mark Thomson, John Birkler from the RAND Corporation, and Donald Winter, former US Secretary of the Navy. So we have a very distinguished panel this morning, and I'm sure we're going to learn all sorts of interesting things. So if I could introduce Stephen Ludlam.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today and share a few industry insights into future submarines in Australia. We do have an extraordinary opportunity to reshape Australia's manufacturing landscape, and the Future Submarines programme is a pivotal part of that transformation. For many people, these ongoing discussions must appear to have an element of Groundhog Day. A robust discussion and debate is a good thing, but at some stage a decision will be made and a course set that ensures we have a submarine capability to protect our borders and support our allies. Having said that, I'm encouraged by the Prime Minister's reaffirmation last week towards the release of the next Defence White Paper next year and returning defence spending to 2% of GDP. There's also a lot of excellent work progressing in organisations such as the DMO and the Future Submarine Integrated Project Team Office in Adelaide. The decisions made as a result of this work will not only provide us with a world-class naval capability, but also underpin a world-class naval shipbuilding industry that will take us well into the middle of this century and beyond. And so I've been asked to provide an industry perspective on the choice we have ahead of us. Obviously, I have an interest in this as part of my role in ASC, but I'm confident that the view I set out is one largely shared by Australia's maritime defence industry. So let me start with why not MOTS? Let's deal with the issue that may still occupy the minds of some experts and commentators, despite the Commonwealth clearly stating its preference for a homegrown product. That is, why do we think we can build a submarine that is better than something that already exists or could easily be modified? That is the MOTS or modified MOTS solution. The 2013 Defence White Paper has ruled a line through these two options, and I think that is a sound judgment. Those people in favour of the MOTS or modified MOTS have argued that these options will reduce risk and be cheaper. We're all aware that Australia has a unique geographical requirements, requiring a submarine that is bigger and can travel further than what many existing designs allow. What often gets left out of the debate is the simple fact that the initial acquisition cost of a submarine is only 1/3 of the total lifetime cost. The other 2/3 are for maintenance and sustainment. Now, I'm sure many of you are driving around in cars that have been imported from Japan, South Korea, Germany, Italy, wherever, essentially bought off the shelf from overseas. For the most part, they're reliable, well-built vehicles. And when they do need a service or occasionally break down, you no doubt don't have any problems finding a mechanic who has the knowledge and experience to service and fix it. You can even download a repair manual for a Hyundai or a BMW off the internet and give it a go yourself if you're keen. And let me assure you, maintaining a submarine is absolutely nothing like maintaining a car. Last time I checked, a repair manual for a Collins-class submarine isn't up on any website, or at least I hope it isn't. The point is this: submarines are incredibly complex and incredibly difficult to maintain. We need to understand an extraordinary amount of detail to really understand the design. And let me assure you from the first-hand experience, the only real way to understand the design is to build it. We put in 50 to 60 sailors, men and women, out into the depths of the Indian or Pacific Oceans, one of the most hostile environments on Earth, and we must be confident we can keep them safe at all times. Every aspect of the submarine needs to be highly reliable and highly available. There are redundant and diverse systems to consider as a consequence. Every bit of the submarine interfaces with every other bit. Make one change in a part of the submarine and it could result in 6 or 7 changes in other parts of the boat. So we need to intimately understand every aspect of the design to maintain it effectively. It is one proposition to acquire a submarine offshore, but we must be able to maintain and service it onshore. Our national security cannot rely on other countries to do this, particularly in times of crisis. So even if we were to buy offshore, we would still need to be across the intricate details of the design. Then and only then would we have a good chance of maintaining the submarine effectively and efficiently and keeping everyone inside it safe. If 2/3 of the costs are in maintenance and 1/3 is in build, then I suggest there's a strong argument that we need to get really good in Australia at designing submarines. We can't do a full design yet, so we need to partner with others. In doing this and understanding the design, it's easier to translate this into plans for build and ultimately building productively. The two become iterative. It makes sense for ourselves in Australia to both design and build the future submarine. It's a lesson learnt from the Collins class, and precisely to avoid the time and effort spent getting the current Collins class operating as it should. We now know a heck of a lot about Collins, and it's beginning to perform very efficiently. And as you know, the latest Coles Progress Review into the sustainment of the Collins class submarine released here yesterday by the Minister described the past 15 months as a remarkable transformation and an astonishing turnaround. What it means for navies that we've already have usually 2 and frequently 3 submarines available on any given day, and we're well on the way to achieving the international benchmark of having 3 submarines material available for sea at all times. ASC's workforce has worked extremely hard and tested the limits of what can be achieved in such a short period. It's required a considerable amount of lateral thinking and challenging the status quo. So we now very much understand the design and have learned how to deal with it. It is now a solid, robust platform. Now, what about modified MOTS? The next argument thrown up is that we should pick an off-the-shelf design and modify it to suit our operational requirements. My response to that is a modified MOTS option is pretty much akin to doing a new design. There's an incredible amount of work involved in taking an existing platform and moving everything around to essentially create a new platform. It's a time-consuming and expensive process, and the end result may still not get you the best possible platform. By way of a simple example, if you're replacing a diesel engine from that which is a standard fit, you might more than likely be confronted with 6 pages containing 50 lines on each page, covering all of the submarine interfaces that are impacted by potentially changing the diesel. Thus, that engine modification effectively becomes a new design in many ways. We should not underestimate the complexity of a modified MOTS. It would have to be thought through very carefully so that we don't end up in a de facto new development and design program. And a lot of submarine builders have found themselves in that position when they simply thought they were modifying it. This leaves an evolved or new design, and looking therefore at the merits of the remaining 2 options, we have an evolved Collins or a brand new design. Evolving designs are pretty much done by every nation, the USA, the UK, Germany, but they all start at somewhere with a new design. I'm not going to bet on a winner today. The Commonwealth is a tough decision to make, but I believe either would be an excellent outcome for the national security, the Defence Force and Australia's naval shipbuilding industry. ASC is involved in both of these exercises with people working in each of those teams. Let me now address the question, does fleet size really matter? So how many submarines do we actually need? A current equation as outlined in the 2013 Defence White Paper is 12, double that of our existing fleet. Wiser heads at the Commonwealth level and in the Royal Australian Navy are in a much better position than me to outline the operational benefits of a fleet expansion. What I can provide is some insight into the significant benefits to productivity and therefore affordability of such a programme. Using the time frame to build the Collins-class fleet as a benchmark, construction of the first submarine, HMAS Collins, started in 1990. The 6th and final submarine, HMAS Rankin, was handed over to the Navy in 2003, a period of 13 years from beginning to end of the build programme. It's now, of course, more than 10 years since the last submarine was delivered, and while some corporate knowledge has been retained in the sustainment phase, we've lost some of the skills from the construction phase. For industry, our considerations aren't just how many submarines we need to maximise the operational capability, but in particular the life cycle of each of these submarines from build through to sustainment. Regardless if that number remains at 12, what we're saying is that we need to build them at a particular rate and have them last at a particular length of time. For example, if it took 3 years to build each submarine and we built 10, that means the build program continues for 30 years. If we build 12, it's 36 years, or we can reduce the build time to 2.5 years each to achieve the 30 years. And after we've built the final submarine, the first one is being retired, and we start again. What this creates is a continuous drumbeat. A consistent, well-planned build means you never have to relearn skills, and we constantly improve in productivity. We would need to change the design and keep our design skills improving, but this is much more achievable with a constant drumbeat to build. The idea of batches of submarines is clearly an approach. Both build and design skills remain at their peak and best affordability achieved. This approach also allows for continuous capability improvement and evolution, so that as new technologies become available, they can be integrated, keeping our fleet at the cutting edge. Another significant advantage is the investment in production techniques. A constant build allows us, for example, to set up a production line, and the tools we can use are likely to be quite different to the tools we would use for a bespoke approach. All of this adds up to better efficiency. The common norm in submarine building is that you could reasonably be efficient after building 3 submarines. But after the 4th, you become a lot better, and therefore you become cheaper to build and with no loss in quality. And if we have a consistent build program at a prescribed length between each ship, that allows us to grow our efficiency at all times. So what about workforce costs? Another argument that's often thrown up against an indigenous shipbuilding capability is the premium associated with the workforce costs. It's acknowledged that part of that premium is associated with the start or restart of the industry. And again, I argue that by putting in place a consistent build program that sees construction continue over 30 years, or indeed 100 years, we bring the learning curve down quite rapidly. The premium we may pay on the first 3 or 4 ships goes away. This continuous build process is viable in other countries, and it can be viable here too. The second area of interest is the rate of pay. It may actually come as a surprise to some that the rates of pay in Australia are broadly comparable to shipbuilding industries around the world. South Korea recognised as one of the powerhouses of shipbuilding, and if you compare our pay rates against Korea, they're actually very similar. So I see absolutely no reason why we can't be efficient and effective like the top-end shipyards around the world. It will take time, and we need to persevere. But it's about lean manufacturing and constantly raising the bar every day on productivity. It's about motivation of the team, and it's about good leadership. It's about all the things we're putting in place at ASC and can be seen in other shipyards around Australia. It's our people that really make the difference, and their skills are vital. Therefore, our ability to build future submarines is, of course, only as good as the people we have to build them. ASC took the decision 3 years ago to run our own apprentice training program, and just last month I welcomed 23 new apprentices to that program. The program now stands at 137 apprentices. Some of these apprentices are straight out of school. Others are older, but have recognised that working with ASC and in the defence industry provides an exciting new career opportunity. There's also no shortage of intellectual ability coming out of our universities. These graduates are extremely capable of undertaking the tasks we want them to do, and they relish the challenge that we, as high-end defence industry, offer. The cadre of young Australians we now have in management roles at ASC are some of the best people I've ever worked with. I don't say that lightly. They're innovative and take great pride in what they do. They're driving change every single day. And I see similar drive for change when I visit one of the hundreds of suppliers lending their expertise to our projects. All of this hasn't happened by accident. We have invested significant resources in seeking to maintain a very good workforce. A part of this is driven by the will to be an industry leader. A part of it is driven by necessity. Just 4 years ago, we had 30 production employees working in ASC's Air Warfare Destroyer shipyard. Today we have 753. If you add the project's associated workforce in New South Wales and Victoria, that number increases significantly. But we do have many lessons learned. You know, a constant refrain from those who would argue against the local design and build of future submarines is to compare it against the issues faced by the Collins-class build and sustainment process. Things don't turn out right, cost more than it should have, it took longer to build than it should have. What makes you think anything will be any better the next time round? And if we abide by this philosophy, if something doesn't turn out right, we should just give up and let somebody else do it. To those people I say, life's all about learning from things that we could have done better, and indeed doing it better next time. And the Coles Progress Review shows how we've learnt from the Collins sustainment process. Life's about continual change, and that's no different to the submarine build programme. If you think you've solved one issue, there'll be something else to solve, and there's always a better way of doing it. Author John C. Maxwell, who's written several books on leadership, says, "A man must be big enough to admit his mistakes, smart enough to profit from them, and strong enough to correct them." Now, many organisations fail to learn from their mistakes. ASC's philosophy is that first and foremost we must be a learning organisation. We must and do review every aspect of what we do, from the root cause through to implementing new ways of working. It's okay to talk about lessons learnt, but if you don't apply them, you're going nowhere. So a key lesson we've learnt from the Collins programme, which must be applied to the Future Submarines programme, is that the design needs to be right from the very beginning. Anything we can do to test these design aspects before you even consider building a submarine is crucial. So one such aspect that I've always been a strong advocate for is the development of prototypes and land-based test facilities. And I'm very pleased that this is a view shared by the Commonwealth. Being able to prove that design by either prototype or on a land-based test facility before implementing it on a submarine will greatly improve the design and reduce the likelihood of problems in the build and then maintenance process. Again, an investment in such prototypes and facilities will have a significant payoff if we're talking about a multi-generational build programme. I also suggest that the sooner the preferred builder can be brought into this process, the better. There needs to be an interactive discussion between the designer and the builder to make sure we're designing something that not only can be built but subsequently maintained. I recall one of those car shows, it may have been Top Gear, where experienced mechanics were given the simple task of replacing a headlight globe in a few popular makes of vehicle. It was like watching a group of 3-year-olds with a child-proof bottle cap. I think in one car it took around 40 minutes to replace a single headlight because it was so inaccessible. Now imagine the same scenario with, say, a critical mission component in a submarine. The 40 minutes required to change a car headlight would potentially translate into weeks of unnecessary dismantling of other systems to get to that critical component in a submarine. That's why the relationship between designer and builder at the earliest opportunity is so critical. So in conclusion, I remind us that we are one of only a handful of nations with the ability to produce our own submarines. We have the opportunity to be innovators, not improvisers, and we have the chance to set up an industrial base that will be affordable and highly productive and will create jobs and provide for Australia's national and economic security and prosperity through to the end of this century and beyond. A new or evolved multi-generational submarine will help to ensure our naval shipbuilding capability can continue for the next century and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for the view from industry. And in fact, what we're going to have this morning during this session is the view of all of the things that you need to pull together to make a submarine work. The skilling base, the systems integration, the industrial base, and the necessary evil that is the resources to fund it. And at that note, I introduced my very good friend and colleague, Dr. Mark Thomson, or also known as my partner in crime, who's ASPI Senior Analyst for Defence Economics, who's going to give us his view. Thank you, Mark.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk about just two things today: efficient submarine manufacture and contracting for the future submarine. More simply, I want to look at the industrial and commercial challenges of building Australia's future submarine. Over the past quarter century, Australian naval shipbuilding has been a mixed bag. Apart from the unqualified success of the Anzac program and, fingers crossed, the successful completion of the 2 LHD vessels, there have been serious problems in every major program we've attempted. In many instances, the problems reflect the intrinsic difficulty of what we've asked industry to do, often in pursuit of Australian unique requirements. Moreover, in most cases, the final outcome has been favourable. Indeed, although it took a while, our mine hunters were eventually completed and the challenging upgrades to the FFG and Anzac class have proven to be a success. Even the Collins looks to be finally fulfilling its potential some 17 years after the first boat hit the water. The most common explanation, apart from Australian unique requirements, for the trials and tribulations experienced by local naval projects is the boom and bust, stop and start schedule imposed upon industry by Defence. If only we had a more continuous workload, we're told, we would have the individual and corporate skills to deliver superior performance. And here's the best part, we're also told we could enjoy reduced costs. Taking this observation to its logical conclusion, many in industry and some in government believe that we need to move to a continuous build program, whereby vessels are delivered in a never-ending stream. Proponents argue for two such production lines, one for subs, one for surface vessels. The archetype of this program, as we've already heard, is the long-running and successful submarine program in Japan. The option of continuous build has been doing the rounds in Australia for a while. It was first emerged in 2002 with the then Naval Shipbuilding and Repair Sector Plan. It's been promoted with vigour in recent years by Defence South Australia and indeed by Steve Ludlam in his last speech. And it was argued for in Defence's 2013 Future Submarine Skilling Plan. The latter report built an argument around the then government's commitment to build 12 submarines. The certainty of 12 boats has since evaporated. Quite properly, the new government says it wants to check the numbers and confirm the requirement for itself. Nonetheless, the potential savings and benefits of a continuous build program will surely be pertinent, especially if an enduring submarine design and build capability remains a goal for the government. With that in mind, I want to turn to critically examine the continuous build option in the context of the future submarine. Everything I'll say will be pertinent to surface vessels as well. Given the scale of our demand for warships, 11 combatants and perhaps as many as 12 submarines, the business case for a continuous build program faces a difficulty. To accommodate a continuous build program working at less than a glacial rate, we'd have to reduce the life of type of our vessels. The question is this: is the added cost of replacing vessels more frequently, offset to some extent by the lesser need for midlife upgrades, justified by the savings and benefits of continuous build? Let me be frank from the start, I'm sceptical. But let me also be clear. The correct way to proceed is to do a business case taking into account the best information that develops and emerges from the submarine program. We should crunch the numbers and find out what the numbers tell us before we go ahead. Having got that on the record, let me explore some of the key issues and explain why I'm doubtful that a continuous build program will turn out to be advisable. Although a continuous build program would allow shipyards to deliver progressively higher productivity, the cost of more frequent replacement would be forbidding, assuming an indicative normal rate of production. According to a paper from ASC Limited, the direct cost of labour only accounts for about 20% of the cost of a warship. Even assuming a favourable learning curve benefit from continuous build, only a fraction of that 20% would be available as a saving. Let's be optimistic and say 6 to 7%. Against this would have to be factored several countervailing costs. First and foremost would be the added cost of more frequent replacement. If, for example, we compared the capital invested needed to maintain a fleet of vessels with a 32-year life of type against that of a 24-year life of type, the premium to be paid in recapitalisation would be 33%. A 24-year life of type is what you get if you produce one boat every 2 years. Even in taking into account further savings from avoiding upgrades, it's difficult to see how the promised savings would compensate for the added costs. Of course, Mr. Ludlam mentioned the option of a 3-year interval between builds. As I said, we'd have to do the business case and check the numbers, but let me say there's a couple of difficulties with that. The first one would be we'd have to segue into this over a period of decades, because the initial tranche of vessels to replace the Collins to ensure no capability gap would have to deliver vessels more quickly than once every 3 years. Otherwise, we'd have a capability gap. And that block of vessels influences the sequencing as you go downstream. Also, it would mean that if we had 3 vessel flights in a sort of continuous upgrade program, each flight would be delivered over almost a decade. So that's, it's a very, very long extended period of time for a block to move through the system. But there'd also be additional costs. By moving to a larger interval between the production of vessels, you'd also be increasing the ratio of administrative and managerial and executive overheads that you were carrying simply to maintain the yard and keep it open while you were producing boats at a slow rate. The problem gets worse the more you try and stretch the time between boats to extend the life of type. There's also a problem with the presumption that increased productivity in a shipyard would result in savings to the taxpayer. In practice, if a shipyard were to exhibit ongoing productivity gains, it would almost certainly result in the savings being split between the Commonwealth, the shipyard workforce and the private sector firms engaged in the project. If this were not to be the case, what incentive would there be for management, workers and their unions to cooperate in delivering higher productivity? A continuous build program would also lock the government into maintaining the size of the submarine and surface fleets. From an RAN perspective, this might be viewed as a wonderful thing. No more need to periodically make the case for the next generation of platforms when it comes time for replacement. From a broader defence perspective, however, it would fix the minimum size of a large and expensive part of the force structure. And from a public policy perspective, it would lock in a substantial chunk of what was previously discretionary spending. A permanent shipbuilder and its workforce would also have every incentive to lobby to preserve their privileged position and expand it to the extent feasible. Already our newspapers are graced with urgent pleas from state politicians, unionists and shipbuilders to avoid the looming so-called valley of death. A small number of players with a strong vested interest in future shipbuilding orders are seeking to shape defence policy. The tail is doing its very best to wag the dog. So where does this leave us? On the one hand, the government appears to be backing away from 12 submarines. On the other, it appears to be committed to developing an enduring submarine design and build capability. I don't see how these two things can be reconciled. As I said, I doubt very much there's a business case for continuous build with 12 boats, although I stress we should do the business case with real data and check. But I'm certain there's no business case to be found for a fleet of 9 or 6 boats. It's already clear that there's going to be a premium paid to satisfy Australian unique requirements in the case of the submarine, and we heard yesterday the justification for doing that. I fear that if we move into a continuous build program without crunching the numbers, we'll be at risk of applying a second premium atop that first one. I want to go on now to talk about contracting for the future sub. As we've heard at this conference, a great deal of effort has been put into defining the specifications of the Collins replacement and developing a design to make good on those specifications. In the next session, we'll hear about project management, and I presume we'll hear more about the commercial arrangements under which the future submarines will be acquired. At the risk of preempting what will follow, I want to make some general observations from an economic perspective on the commercial arrangements under which the future submarines will be built. Let me begin with an assertion that I believe should underpin any approach we adopt. Once we've decided what sort of submarines we want, we should strive to acquire them as efficiently as possible. I trust there's no disagreement on that point. Acquiring the submarines efficiently requires two things. First, the inputs into the project, labour, capital, technology, must be brought together as efficiently as possible through optimal planning and sound project management. My preceding comments about the merits or otherwise of a continuous build program are an example of one of the many questions surrounding the optimal coordination of inputs that we need to be grappling with. The difficulties experienced by the Air Warfare Destroyer project are an example of how hard it can be to achieve such coordination, even with something close to an off-the-shelf design. Second, the price paid for the various inputs into the project must be kept to a minimum. By a minimum, I mean that the price paid to every firm, to every worker, to every government bureaucrat engaged in the project should only be that necessary to secure their time and service on the project, not 1 cent more. Clearly, such a happy outcome for the taxpayer will be difficult to achieve. Only in the theoretical world of a perfect market, where the prices paid by consumers equal the costs incurred by suppliers, can such an expectation be met. In the real world, markets exhibit substantial imperfections, and suppliers work hard to avoid price competition by developing unique products and nurturing strong brands. In the defence arena, the already substantial departure from market perfection has only increased over the past 2 decades as the number of suppliers has dwindled due to industry consolidation. Over the same period, and partly in response to that trend, Australia has changed the way it goes about buying naval platforms. In the 1980s and 1990s, major purchases such as the Collins, Minehunter Coastal and Anzac frigates were procured through open competition. Defence sought tenders to fulfil performance requirements. Those with a product meeting those specifications bid for the work. A successful tenderer was chosen and the prime contractor got on with delivering the product under a fixed price contract. I should note, in the case of the Collins, the process was a little more complex than that. In any case, under the competition model, the fact that multiple suppliers were bidding for the contract gave some comfort, though no guarantee, that costs were being constrained. Bidding firms had a strong incentive to develop efficient production arrangements and to constrain the prices paid to labour and subcontractors. But as the Collins program showed, when things went bad, when the money ran out, the risk invariably reverted to the Commonwealth, and it was the taxpayer that footed the bill for the extensive remedial work needed to bring the Collins class into service. By the 2000s, the competitive model lived on and was used by the LHD program, but another model emerged as well in the form of an alliance approach adopted for the Air Warfare Destroyer program. Rather than asking firms to bid for fixed price contracts, Defence selected firms via a beauty contest to play the role of shipbuilder, combat system integrator and preferred designer. There was an extended period of analysis to refine costs and decide upon the final design. In effect, the government worked closely with the selected shipbuilder and integrator to choose between its preferred design and an off-the-shelf option. The off-the-shelf option won, to the surprise of many. An alliance between the Commonwealth and its shipbuilder and integrator then proceeded to get on with the project. For the first time in Australia, a cooperative rather than competitive approach was used in a major naval construction project. To try and ensure efficiency, the Air Warfare Destroyer project is employing pain share, gain share contracting arrangements to provide incentives for the participants to boost productivity and contain costs. But as we've heard recently, once the veil of secrecy was finally pulled back by the Australian National Audit Office, the project is experiencing some problems. Let's hope they get things back on track. As is almost always the case with multi-billion-dollar defence projects, when things go wrong, only the Commonwealth has the financial capacity to pick up the pieces. The acquisition strategy for the future submarine is likely to be different again. As I understand, there is about to be a round of consultations with industry that will eventually lead to the formation of some sort of special purpose entity whose job it will be to deliver the submarines. I hope that subsequent speakers today will flesh out the details to the extent that there is clarity to be had on how this will occur. It would be pointless for me to speculate on what the arrangement might look like. Instead, let me conclude by outlining 3 things that I'll be looking for when we hear about how the acquisition strategy will look in more detail. First, what is the nature of the contract under which the submarines will be delivered? Given the many uncertainties and ambiguities in the project, a fixed price contract would appear to be infeasible, at least in the first instance for the first tranche of vessels. So what will it be? Cost plus, target cost estimate plus plane share, gain share. Critically, we need to know how risk will be shared between the Commonwealth and the submarine building entity. There could well be a case for adopting different approaches at different stages of the project. The critical question is how best to constrain costs, drive performance, and provide incentives for productivity growth as the project evolves. Second, what mechanisms will be put in place to benchmark productivity and overheads in the submarine building entity to ensure that we're getting value for money? And to what extent will that information be made public so that taxpayers can see how their billions of dollars are being spent? The sad reality is that successive governments have been happy to endure poor performance from suppliers right up until the point where problems hit the newspapers. Then and only then are they spurred into action. Transparency is one of the surest routes to driving efficiency in any future submarine construction venture. Third, what role will the government-owned ASC Limited play in the project? Will ASC be sold? If it's sold, will it be divided into a submarine building and a shipbuilding component? Or perhaps will it be divided into a submarine building, submarine maintaining, and a shipbuilding component? Will its infrastructure be retained as a government asset, as in the case of Garden Island? The question of ASC Limited's ownership is critical. I'm on the public record as far back as 2002 arguing that ASC should be sold into the private sector so that commercial imperatives can be injected into the organisation. Nothing that's happened over the past 12 years has led me to conclude otherwise. Let me conclude by saying the following. In fairness to the other speakers that follow, it may be too early to answer some of these questions, but the sooner we start thinking about them and debating them in public, because it's public money that's being spent, the better chance we'll have of making the future submarine project a success. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And in introducing Mark, I didn't mention that Mark and I first met when we were studying physics back in the 1980s. And in fact, I noticed looking at the CVs that this entire panel this morning, this entire table, constitutes physics graduates. I'm not sure what the collective noun for physicist is. I'm sure there should be one, but answers on a postcard, please. Our next speaker is Mr. John Birkler, Senior Fellow at the RAND Corporation, who manages RAND's Maritime program, overseeing research for an exhaustive and I suspect exhausting group of customers. But he's very well placed to talk to us today about building the right industry skills for the submarine program, as he was actually the lead on the RAND analysis of Australia's capabilities and capacities to design conventional submarines, something that I suspect many of us in this room have studied quite intensively. But John, thank you.
Good. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm glad to be here today and have the opportunity to talk about designing Australia's future submarine. The acquisition of defence systems is big business in Australia, as well as in the US, most of Europe, Asia, Middle East. This is nothing new. In their day, the acquisition was just as big an enterprise for Hannibal and his elephants, Nelson and his armadas, and Napoleon and his artillery. But as in most human endeavors, one cannot assume a high correlation between the passage of time and progress, and despite years of challenge and reform, the acquisition of weapon systems continues to challenge us all. Today I'm going to talk about a RAND study that was conducted to inform Australia's senior leadership about the design of large, capable submarines. Do I have to point this in a certain direction? Okay. Designing submarines and managing their production are extraordinarily complex endeavors. And I've tried to highlight this on this chart. And I won't go through each of the individual categories, but as you can see, the level of activity that's required for a tank, the Boeing 777, frigate, and a notional conventional submarine. In almost every case, the submarine is just significantly more complex enterprise. In fact, I think it's one of the most challenging things that we undertake in the engineering community. Okay. Adding to this complexity, when we did our study, there were many key program decisions that had not yet been made. We've heard discussions about the performance of the future submarine in terms of displacement, range, endurance, things like that are still being thought through. There's a question of derivative versus new design. There's always a question of how you effectively manage risk. What is the appropriate role of government and industry, and what are their associated responsibilities? And when is the first of the class required? These uncertainties mean that it's quite challenging at this stage of the program to make detailed projections of the total level of effort, the duration of the design phase, and what the future submarine will require. The question that was put to RAND was, can Australia design a successor to Collins? We broke that down into 4 questions that we pursued. The first is the demand. Okay? What are the things that are required in terms of design process, skills, and tools to design a large, very capable, modern, conventional submarine? The report that we did, it will detail the process and tools. Today, I'm just going to focus on the skill sets. And so we first tried to understand the demand. Our second step in our analysis was to look at the supply. Then we would try and identify what gaps there were, and if there were gaps, identify ways in which we could fill those gaps. We used several methods to estimate the demand for skilled personnel. We first gathered proprietary data on Upholder and the Collins designs. We had point estimates developed by experienced submarine designers and program managers. Some of the folks we used, for example, was the technical director of the Virginia-class Design and Systems Engineering, a former director of naval architecture at Electric Boat, a former director of the Naval Sea Systems Command Submarine and Submersible Design and Engineering Systems. So I thought we had a pretty experienced and knowledgeable team that we worked with. And part of the process was to develop these estimates. And what I have here, as you see on the right part of the curve, is the RAND team developed 2 sets of estimates. We developed a high end on what we thought it would take, and then a lower end. And these estimates reflect the skill base of the workforce and the complexity and the size of the boat that we thought would most probably be the outcome. And you can see the experts that developed the curve independently is the blue curve in the middle. So I think we're pretty much on track. And while I can't show you the Upholder and the Collins data because of the proprietary nature of it, I can assure you that those curves pretty much fell right on top of the curves that I've shown you here. Another question that we were asked was, what's the size of the government organization in order to effectively manage and provide the constructive tension that's required to yield a successful program outcome? And based on our experience, the experience with Collins and RAND's experience in the US and UK analysis, turns out to be about 15 to 20+%. And this translates to about between 80 and 175 technical personnel on the government side above the line to support the future submarine program. So now we have an idea of what the demand is in terms of skill sets, what exists in Australia. Okay. To answer this question regarding the supply of design resources, we looked at a variety of dimensions. First is the number of technical people in industry, including the offshore oil and gas industry. How many people were in government and in academia. And then we tried to look at the number of people that had experience with submarines, that were proficient in the submarine space, if you will. We looked at the future demand on those resources. For example, we have the air warfare destroyer, we have the Collins work that's going on, and now some emphasis on the future frigate. Okay. We also worked closely and talked with the organizations to gain their perspective on how you could efficiently expand this workforce. And then we also explored what design tools and facilities were available in Australia. To accomplish this, we worked closely with the program office, and we sent out a survey to Australian industry, academia, and government. I think there were a total of over 50 surveys that were sent out. And I think many of you in this room received those surveys, and once we got the data back from the surveys, we went out and visited the firms to make sure we understood the data and the things that they were telling us. This chart shows, as a result of the survey, the submarine experienced draftsmen and engineers available in Australia, non-government, at the time we did the study. And you can see we broke it out by skill, and these were the numbers that came out of that, okay? So this is essentially the supply part of the question. Okay. Now, the next step is what gaps exist, and we're going to try and match supply and demand, and that's going to be, I think you'll find that very revealing. So this is the outcome. The number available I showed you in the previous chart is in that column. The peak demand, this is the number of people you'll need right at the top of the curve when there's the most activity ongoing, is shown for the 8 million man-hour program and then the 12 million man-hour program. I won't go through all of these, but you can see for draftsmen, there's approximately a dozen or so that are available, that are proficient in submarine, the submarine space, and on the right two columns shows you the number that you're probably going to need at the peak, okay? And you can see in almost every other category there's a serious shortfall that's going to have to be filled. Okay. So how do you fill that gap? Well, what RAND did, we're a very analytical organization. We like to be able to say that we can say it with numbers. And so we took in the lower left-hand corner the demand curves that I showed you earlier, the 8 million and 12 million man-hour curves. We know what the supply is, or what was out there at the experience level. We built an analytical tool that takes into consideration the labor characteristics. For example, what's the maximum growth rate? You just can't grow forces, by hiring anybody off the street. You've got to be reasonably selective. There's attrition associated with the workforce that goes on. There's also a mentoring ratio, and what I mean by that is a senior person or experienced person can only supervise so many people. There's worker availability, what type of people are graduating from your schools, what type of people might be available from other industrial sectors, such as the offshore oil and gas, the mining industry, and things like that. And so then we put that into our model, and then we also looked at some workforce efficiencies in terms of what's the productivity, how much overtime can you use effectively in a shipyard, and what the training burden is. So when we put all that together and run it through our analytical tool, what comes out is the total labor hours that you're going to need to complete this design and what the impact is on schedule. To drive down a little bit and just give you one example of the level of detail we went to at RAND, this shows the time it takes for somebody with a basic engineering or technical skill set to become proficient in the submarine space, in order to become a fully productive employee. And you can see it ranges considerably, but on average it takes about 3 years before someone becomes fully productive. So we use this in our analytical tool, and when we step through that, what we find is the model suggests that drawing from the Australian experienced submarine workforce, no surprise, it'll lengthen the program and increase the man hours compared with a fully proficient workforce. As I mentioned earlier, the available workforce is about 475 individuals when we were doing this program. It's obviously increased a bit since then. But again, I need to point out that all those folks right now currently have day jobs, working on the Collins, working on other maritime programs. And so not all of them are going to be available. And so one of the questions we tried to answer was, let's say if we only started out with 20% of those folks on the new future submarine, our analytical tools and insights tell us that it would take an additional 4 years to complete the design and involve about 20% more man hours. If you could double that percentage to 40% of the available pool, the design effort would require an additional 3 years and about 15% more man hours. Another way to effectively manage that peak is to lengthen the design period to 20 years, and that effectively cuts the design man hours in half. So, how can you add this experience? Okay. Well, in multiple ways. Industry, firms can hire internationally. They can do reach back to their other offices. There can be collaborations. You can integrate the two design groups. You might, for example, think about giving a complete section of the submarine to one of these firms, for example, the machinery spaces, or assign them a specific system. On the government side, they can draw from the Collins class or other maritime programs in combination with hiring new personnel, or draw core personnel from the Collins to start the program and then grow new personnel. So this is really, I think, going to be a challenge. So the final question here, can Australia design a successor to the Collins? The answer is yes, but. Building it domestically with a domestic workforce will increase the design man-hours and consequently the cost and lengthen the schedule. Collaboration can be used to lengthen the design man-hours and shorten the schedule, but in any event, this program is going to probably require about, at the peak, about 1,000 person in the design team, and that includes the government and the platform designers. Okay. So that kind of concludes my presentation. I will say that the report is available for download on the RAND website. It's just www.rand.org. I suspect most of you have seen the report or downloaded it, because before, when I came to the conference, I checked with our publications folks, and the report, much to my amazement, has been downloaded over 7,500 times. So, okay, good. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Our last speaker in this session this morning, before we open it up to what I think will be a pretty lively forum, is Dr. Donald Winter, who is a Professor of Engineering Practice in the Department of Naval Architecture and Marine Engineering at the University of Michigan, and was also the 74th Secretary of the US Navy from 2006 to 2009. He's going to talk to us this morning about the always challenging task of systems integration in a submarine project. Thank you, Donald.
Good morning. It's good to be back here. Good to be able to join you this morning for this panel, and good to be able to talk about a topic that I've been engaged in for over 40 years, that of associated with systems engineering and integration. Before I do that, though, I'd like to start off with a couple of disclosures. First of all, it should be perhaps obvious, I am talking today from a personal position. My views, what I say today, do not any longer represent the official position of the U.S. Navy, and they are based on personal observations over many, many years. Second of all, I will note that while I was specifically asked to talk about system integration, my experience has been that one needs to talk about system integration in the overall context of systems engineering and integration. And so I broadened my addressed matters here to more fully, I think, deal with some of the challenges that are sitting in front of us as we discuss the future of Australia's submarine activities. I'll give you my bottom line up front, a few basic comments that you can take away from here. Perhaps go and run and get a cup of coffee here quickly. But I'll just argue, first of all, that systems engineering and integration skills, the SE&I component of any major project, particularly projects involved in the development of complex systems, are absolutely critical to the successful prosecution of those development activities. One of the things I found fascinating, in particular being in the Pentagon, was just doing a very quick correlation check between programs that were experiencing difficulty and programs that had, in the course of their development, shortchanged one way or another the systems engineering and integration skills that were rather critical to successful development. Almost a one-for-one correlation there. Systems engineering and integration is a necessary, albeit not necessarily sufficient, condition for a successful development. Point two, there's no standard process that works in all cases. In the United States, we've used a variety of different approaches to be able to achieve the desired effects, some of which have worked well, some of which have not. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I will argue that what is optimum, if you will, for any given program depends upon a lot of program-specific factors. It has to do with the stakeholders that you're dealing with, not just the user, but the sustainer. And oh, by the way, in some cases, those sponsoring different mission objectives have to deal with the financial matters, the political considerations, the issues of the industrial base and other factors involved, and a reconciliation of all of those into a solution set which represents a reasonable compromise addressing each party's interest in an appropriate manner. There are very significant issues associated with the maturity of design. To what extent are we talking about a minor derivation, augmentation of an existing product? To what extent are we talking about a new product or a new product for a given group and organization? How complex is that design? How challenging are the integration aspects? And, oh, by the way, what is available in the industry and in the government to be able to draw upon to provide the critical systems engineering and integration resources that are so necessary to a project like this? It's interesting to go back and take a look at the genesis of the SE&I approach, the systems engineering and integration approach in the United States. And you can trace it back really to the early days of the Cold War. Just to remind you in your studies of history, World War II for the United States was very much of a production effort from an industrial perspective. We were arguably one of the arsenals of democracy that was able to outproduce the Axis in terms of ships, in terms of aircraft, in terms of land vehicles. Quantity was the principal metric of concern there. With the start of the Cold War, we had to reassess that situation. It became evident for a number of factors that the United States and the NATO forces were not in a position to be able to offset the Warsaw Pact on a one-for-one basis. The Warsaw Pact would always have more tanks on their side of the Folder Gap than we did on our side. And a lot of considerations here, not the least of which has to do with the reluctance in the United States to support a very large standing army during peacetime activities. And while many recognize the challenges of the Cold War, many also were tired of what had transpired during World War II. We went into a new construct. The construct had to do with what is termed qualitative advantage. We may not have as many tanks as the Warsaw Pact did. We may not have had as many ships or aircraft, but ours would simply be better than theirs. We would obtain that qualitative advantage through the employment of advanced technologies and the integration of those into systems that provided us with clearly distinctive capabilities. That proved to be a great challenge. One of the areas in which that challenge became self-evident very early on was associated with the development of ballistic missiles, both in the Air Force ICBM program and the Navy Fleet Ballistic Missile Program, the FBM activity. The initial approach that was chosen in terms of the concept to be developed of those systems proved to be nearly impossible to execute successfully. After many tries and a recognition of the challenges there, a decision was made to reach out to independent organizations, organizations like Ramo Wooldridge, which became TRW. And oh, by the way, I'm proud to say that in early days of my career, I was mentored by Cy Ramo, the R in TRW, who was the chief systems engineer for the Air Force ICBM program, a role that he had with one specific function in mind, to be able to provide the systems engineering and integration capability associated with that Air Force ICBM program. Now, one of the interesting aspects of that whole structure was that Ramo Wooldridge was a trusted agent of our government. Part of the reason it was a trusted agent was simply because it had no vested interest whatsoever in any of the decisions, no vested financial interest. Reputational interest, unquestionably, but not financial. We had hardware and later software exclusion clauses in the contracts which precluded any extraction of value, if you will, from decisions that were made. And in fact, there were a number of key decisions that were made that fundamentally changed the course of the development of both the ICBM and FBM activities. Now, to get the critical skills that we needed to be able to do that assessment, to do the trade-offs between nuclear warhead sizing and weight and propulsion system capability and the guidance accuracies that could all be achieved, to be able to work across such a disparate set of technologies became a real challenge. And the development of the core capabilities to be able to support that activity on an unconflicted basis was an interesting effort. we wound up with a number of organizations that provided such capabilities for a number of different programs spanning the full spectrum of military activities. Some of these were government entities. Some of them had to do with not-for-profit organizations, some associated with universities, some truly independent, and some that were part of profit-making companies, but without direct coupling into the financials associated with the programs that they supported. The objectives were common. The objectives here were first and foremost to be able to recruit and retain the people that were needed. And this was not a trivial challenge. We needed people, we needed the rocket scientists, we needed the people whose skills were rare, and we needed to be able to retain them, notwithstanding the limitations and compensation associated with direct government service. And one of the principal reasons why many of these organizations were set up outside the government structure. We needed to be able to hold on to these people, to retain them, to be able to develop a corporate memory, so that as we went from one program to another program, we were able to learn from our mistakes and not repeat them. And they were, in fact, the repository, became the repository for the lessons learned, which have served us quite well over many years. And as I said before, we were able to utilize them as trusted agents because of their independence, because their decisions did not have an impact on any of the financial considerations associated with the organizations they work with or their individual personal compensation. Now, all of this, quite frankly, worked well for a number of years. Yes, there are problems, and there is no nation, I think, that can claim that it has been immune from developmental challenges, particularly as we have tried to continue to improve our capabilities and the efficiency of those capabilities. We did face a very specific challenge, however, in the early 90s. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89, politically in the United States, a peace dividend was declared, or at least it was stated to be expected. We needed to be able to materially reduce the budget for the Department of Defense, to be able to reallocate those resources to domestic programs that were deemed by the administration at that time to be of higher priority. Within the Pentagon, there was, quite frankly, a reluctance to cancel many activities or push off planned new activities. There was the belief that these were truly needed, and there was also the hope that future administrations would recognize the tenuous nature of the course that was underway. There was a mad search for mechanisms that would materially reduce the cost of development. And I will tell you, I will stipulate up front that this was in part a search for real cost savings and in part a search for the ability to claim cost savings and to be able to argue that programs should be permitted to continue, notwithstanding material reductions in the price. One of the items that was glommed onto, one of the concepts, was the idea of commercial. And for a certain time period, anything that was deemed to be commercial, and that's either commercial or COTS or any of the variants associated with that, was deemed to be good. Everything that was military was deemed to be bad. The view was that the commercial industry does things so much better. I mean, who hears about the great overruns on major commercial developments? Well, they exist, they're there. Take a look at the history of commercial aircraft development in the United States. It's very evident. It's just not publicized. It doesn't have to be. It's not part of the public record. It's part of the private record. Nonetheless, there was a push to move to all things commercial. We talked about COTS, open system standards, all those good things. We also talked about commercial-styled acquisitions. And this is a place where we kind of, quite frankly, went to the dark side. All of a sudden, it was deemed to be unnecessary for military departments to write specifications for systems to be acquired. We talked about replacing specifications with SUNs, statements of need. with the idea that commercial industry would come in with great ideas, and we'd go shopping, take a look at one car sales place, another car sales place. You know, do you want a Holden? Do you want a Toyota? What would you like to buy today, sir? Notwithstanding the fact that obviously the competition that exists in the commercial market is not replicated in the military systems market. There is no commercial market for submarines, for aircraft carriers, things of that nature. The forces of the marketplace do not work in the same way. Nonetheless, this is where we were headed. And we replaced concepts like oversight with concepts like insight. You can read this basically as, we're going to pull back and let the contractors do what they can, and hope like hell that what comes out the other end really serves the needs of the military. One of the interesting aspects of all of this was that we were able to materially reduce the size of the technical organizations within the Navy. And in fact, as the saying went, many of those technical people went to the other side of M Street, from the Navy Yard to the industrial facilities and offices on the other side of the street down in Washington. And we lost much of the capability at that point in time. It truly was a hemorrhaging. Much of this was codified through a concept called a PIC, Prime Integration Contract, where the contractor now, the prime contractor, was expected to take on virtually the entirety of the systems engineering and integration activities, including the definition of the basic concept that was to be developed. A few observations after seeing this work and not work over a number of years. First of all, I will say that in terms of the concept of COTS, there are a few examples where it works well. I used to tell people I had a couple of Dell computers in my office, and the last thing I wanted was a Navy-developed computer for my office. The Dell computers work just fine, thank you very much, and we don't need to remind everybody of all the companies that were in the business and went out of business due to the very aggressive competitive practices that were applied by way of the commercial marketplace. We've had a few good examples, I believe, of adaptation of commercial products. I'm particularly proud of the P8 program. I think it's one of those examples where we've been able to leverage an ongoing production activity to derive out of that a valuable military capability, to leverage the invested base of technology, the tooling, the personnel, the production capabilities, limit the sensitivity to order quantity on an annual basis, and get a good product. And oh, by the way, I believe there are 2 P8s right now being used in the search for the Malaysian aircraft out of Australia right now. In most cases, I will note, however, that we grossly underestimated the effort required to adapt commercial products. The original concept for the littoral combat ship was to adapt the HM&E from a fast coastal ferry. And oh, by the way, fast coastal ferries were going for $200 million a pop, and so therefore we should be able to do that for around the same numbers. Until we got into it and started going through all the changes that were going to be necessary, not just to accommodate the multi-mission modules that were being separately procured, but also to be able to deal with some of the unique requirements of naval operation as opposed to commercial operation, did we really fully understand the implications of what we got into. With regard to the PIC concept, the Prime Integration Contract, I will say that that has proven to be, in general, less than satisfactory. Having contractors attempt to optimize solutions and dealing with a multiplicity of governmental and non-governmental stakeholders is truly a challenge. We wind up fundamentally diminishing the ability of the government and the military in particular to influence the design and production approach. And often we find that we are optimizing a specific acquisition as opposed to optimizing the enhancement to the fleet. I always used to say that I'm more interested in how much improvement to the fleet's capability I could buy with a given dollar than I was in terms of how much ship I could buy with a given dollar. The two are not necessarily the same when one starts looking at issues such as crew size, sustainment costs, sparing, things of that nature. There are clear conflicts of interest, and there are limitations to what can be done in terms of motivation through commercial terms to be able to correct such issues. I will say that we are still in the process of learning many lessons associated with challenges like this. The requirements for SE&I are very diverse. It does go depending on program to program. There are elements of this that I feel very strongly must be led and mostly done by military personnel, by the military departments. The concepts of operation in particular, and oh, by the way, when I talk about CONOPS, I don't mean just the mission operations, but it's everything from trials through operations sustainment and disposition in the end that needs to be thought through and considered in terms of its potential for driving requirements. That's got to be done clearly by the military. There are areas there where contract help can be valuable. On the other hand, there's the other extreme. When we get involved in the detailed integration of complex software-based systems, who is in the best position to work through that software integration strategy and the verification details associated with it? That most likely is going to be focused, centered on the industrial side. It needs to be overseen by an independent observer that can ensure that, in fact, the verification activities have been performed to the satisfaction of the end user, but it is going to require those individuals who are directly involved in the detailed design and integration efforts to be able to ensure that the work is done correctly. A few summary comments, if I could. New systems are really hard, and new systems don't have to be new systems. We very rarely do anything that's a true clean sheet of paper. I'm trying to figure out what it means in a CAD system to have a clean sheet of paper, but I think you understand the concept. But anything that's new, and one of the things I tell my students is that the simplest metric for risk on a program is the new count, the number of times that you can count something new or some aspect new. One needs to ensure that there is the opportunity to assess those issues, to do a proper risk assessment, to look at the trades, and make the determination as what is in the best interest of the sovereign and the military, and to ensure that that's done on a conflict-free basis. Every program is going to be unique. I don't think that future submarine is going to be the same as past Collins activity, and it's going to be different from surface activities as well. One needs to spend the time to think it through, to understand what the challenges are, to understand what capabilities need to be applied and where those capabilities can be obtained from. I will assert that there's never enough time to do it right, but if one doesn't, it will take even longer. I've seen that time and time again. And with that, I thank you very much for the opportunity to come here and one more time try to deliver my Sunday morning sermon.
Right. We're about to open things up for questions. I'll just point out to my colleague, Dr. Schreer, that Ben, the trains are almost running on time. Now, I have a number of questions if I have to invoke chairman's privilege here, but I'm sure that there's plenty of questions from the floor as well. So over to you. The physicist will take your questions now.
Hi there. I'm Chris Lloyd from Thales Australia. One of the questions I have is really relating to the story of shipbuilding and engineering. And one of the debates over the last 20 years has been the discussion about how much you invest in the engineering effort in terms of its impact on ship production, productivity, or more particularly rework, and subsequently its impact on the cost of ownership in terms of the through-life cost of maintenance of it all. And I was wondering whether the panel had any view of whether or not there was a consensus emerging as to what the right balance is between investing in the engineering effort upstream, picking up on the last comment just made recently there, and the returns you're going to get in terms of reducing production costs and the cost of ownership. And then taking that, if there is a consensus, what do we think would that be applicability from the point of view of Australia, bearing in mind that we're starting from a pretty low base in design and engineering terms, and what advice that would give us, or what insights and suggestions that would make in terms of how we approach the possibility or feasibility of outsourcing, subcontracting, or geographically dispersing that engineering skill.
See, I'll try to take a crack at part of that. I will suggest that some of my worst experiences have been associated with organizations or activities that have attempted to effectively ignore the issue. I just as soon not go into the details of the specifics here, but one of the programs that I wound up having to terminate, effectively refusing to permit it to go into production, was a maritime activity, where we were greatly disappointed by the reliability and availability statistics that showed up during the initial operational test and evaluation phase. This was associated with products that were part of what we call low-rate initial production. And in digging into the issue as to why we were so surprised, I found out that what had happened in the initial phases of the program was that the budget that had been submitted was not actually received by the program, the budget request. So they had to make a number of cutbacks in the program activity, and they elected, for various reasons, to eliminate all reliability modeling and activity. And so not only were we in a position of not having good data, we had no idea at that point in time whether or not we were getting the type of performance that we should have expected given the design, which gave me great concern about any corrective action at that point. Now that's an extreme view. If you say, okay, we're going to address the problem, and you're questioning how much investment do you want to make in that, I think that is an issue that has to be dealt with based on engineering judgment and experience. And to a certain extent, it's a matter of investing and seeing what you get with that investment. Wayne Myers had a phrase, build a little, test a little, learn a lot. Wayne Myers was the father of the Aegis system. And I think that that applies in this particular circumstance. If you're able to make certain investments in an engineering sense that identify significant improvements in terms of the sustainability of the product, you're onto something, keep doing it. If you're finding that you're not getting good return on investment, you may want to take another look and see whether or not you're making the correct investment. I can't give you a specific fraction. I don't believe there is a certain specific quantity number that is justifiable and supportable across the board of a very diverse set of activities.
I might just make one observation there, that with the CNED review suggested that we should spend something like 10 to 15% of a project budget before second pass. I don't think we've ever done that. The Air Warfare Destroyer project, for instance, the amount spent would be well in single digits as a percentage of the total cost, and I think we've seen the consequences of that.
I could probably just add a little bit, almost anecdotally really, that the most productive yards around the world tend to do all their engineering up front all the planning up front, have all the materials ready before they start production. It's more anecdote than anything, but I think, you know, if you, it's observable. It's a little bit more than anecdote. And to your second point, where, you know, we got the skills here. With John's presentation clearly outlined that we don't yet have the skills. I'm not sure I like the term outsourcing, but certainly partnering with a designer, I think is vitally important to us on Future Submarine. Choosing the right designer that will allow the design to be owned by Australia will be very significant, and that's why I don't like quite the use of outsourcing. And secondly, choosing the designer that would allow capability to be built up in Australia would be quite important from my aspect also. So just adding to Dr. Winter's points.
Chris Skinner, question for Stephen Ludlam, and you've actually partially answered my question, but I'll pose it anyway. But before doing so, I would point out that the Australian National Audit Office stated that $260 million was spent on the AWD in the 5 years up to the second pass. What that is a percentage of the whole, I haven't worked out. 3, okay, fair enough. John Birkler pointed out a significant shortfall based on the analysis of the RAND Corporation, and did mention the possibility of outsourcing as one of several means to meet that shortfall. Dr. Winter gave very, very interesting examples of trusted agencies ranging from universities at Johns Hopkins on the one hand all the way through to TRW and lots of other groups. My question for Stephen Ludlam is, based on your own presentation and what we heard yesterday afternoon, would you be comfortable regarding the IPT, as described yesterday afternoon, as a trusted agent that you would not include in your recent comment of not liking outsourcing?
Yeah, I think it's the outsourcing word that I don't like. I think that's sort of has a commercial connotation to, I don't want to do this work any longer, I'm going to give it to somebody else to do. And as a consequence, there's a high potential that you lose the skills associated with that work. So that's why I don't like the phrase outsourcing. I do prefer the words partnering, you know, a capability partner particularly. The IPT is naturally a very, very important part. In fact, it's the starting part of the way that we will design in Australia. And it will start by giving a reference to the design, you know, some ideas on the design, but more particularly we'll start by giving the core of the, I think we've been using the term intelligent customer, but it's all part of the design capability that we need. And John's work is well known to many of us. In fact, we were some contributors to that work, as many people in the audience were. So the gap in terms of skills has been known for a long time. And that's where the IPT really is now. I suspect there are people from the IPT who could speak better to it than I. But they are now trying to work out how that gap can be fulfilled. And we may hear from David Gould later what the industrial collaboration sort of ideas might be. So it's the word outsourcing that I don't like. I think the capability partners are really important.
Just one, if I could just add one thought here. One of the changes that we've seen in the U.S. Forced by other considerations has been industrial repositioning activities. And by that I mean that a number of companies that historically have been producers, manufacturers, have elected to try to transition into integrators to avoid, in many cases, the additional capital investment associated with either expanding or modernizing their property, plant, and equipment. And many of those have proven to be problematic because the companies entered into arrangements to outsource certain of their functions with the misbelief that they were also outsourcing their risk. And in most cases, they found that they never were able to outsource their risk. They retained all risk, all responsibility, all accountability, and were merely having others help them execute the program. And in particular, in all too many cases, they found that they grossly underestimated the effort and skills that were going to be required to manage that outsourced activity. And in many cases, they found that the actual cost increased, not decreased, notwithstanding the purported efficiencies of some specialty houses to be able to provide specific manufacturing capability at low cost. One needs to look at it in a total sense. One needs to recognize that one can never transfer or give the risk and responsibility to others, and one needs to plan for the totality of that transition if that is going to be done for purposes either of capital investment or in terms of availability of personnel.
And we had a question up the back there. I think Kim, was it?
Kim Bergman, Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. A question mainly for Mark. Mark, you remind me of my dismal accountant with this preoccupation with money. I would have thought that it's self-evident that a rolling program of almost anything is far less disruptive than what we've been, the pattern that we've seen in Australia of hiring workforces, getting them skilled, sacking them, rehiring them, companies opening up, closing down, facilities closing, new ones having to be reopened. All of these things come at a cost, and I'd just like your comments on that perspective on things.
Thank you, Kim. I think it's fair to say that a continuous build program would be less disruptive. But I don't think less disruptive is necessarily desirable unless it's going to give us a better outcome, a more efficient outcome. I think we need to crunch the numbers on the continuous build. You know, in the non-defence world, things are produced in one of two ways. Things are produced by factories, in which case there's a continuous production line where, for example, cars are produced in a certain model, next year a new model comes out. If you're producing lots of cars, there's no question, you build yourself a factory. At the other extreme, you've got things like tunnels under Sydney Harbour. How often do you build a tunnel under Sydney Harbour? Maybe once every 100 years. If you're building tunnels under Sydney Harbour, you don't have a factory. What you have is a project. You bring people together, you pay due regard to the skills, you might have to go offshore, you get specialists in, you execute the tunnel, and then you disperse the workforce. And they go and work in other places. I'm told that some of the people who built the tunnel under Sydney Harbour went on to work on the Anzac program, for example, part of the sort of mobility of the workforce in the current day and age. I'm not saying that I can tell you from my back of the envelope scribblings that a continuous build program with 12 or however many submarines will be a bad proposition. What I'm saying is we need to crunch the numbers and find out whether it's a project or it's something that lends itself to a factory. And at the end of the day, it's a matter of looking at the cost involved, taking into account the different risk profiles that the two approaches will give you. Now, I think it's fair to say that a continuous build program will, over time, put you in a better situation to manage some of the risks that emerge in one-off projects. And that's a factor that would have to be taken into account. On the other side, the list of things that I mentioned need to be taken into account too. We've got lots of work's being done here on a submarine project. I think the continuous build program should be on the table as something to be analysed and judged on its merits, but most certainly not taken as a mandated part of the program from ab initio.
I might just add a little bit, because I think my intuition, Kim, is similar to yours. Your intuition that a continuous build program would be a good thing, but I do accept some of many of Mark's points. In actual fact, I mean, what Mark does is he identifies a few of the parameters in the equation that's necessary to determine what the optimum point is, and I think, Kim, you added a few more of the parameters into that equation. What's not yet identified is what that equation is, and we called that the business case, and I agree. You know, we've got to work out through what the business case. Now, I wouldn't like anybody to think that what I was offering in my little talk there was the perfect solution. It wasn't. It was to raise the issue about continuous build, and that some of the parameters can be moved around to suit what could be a very productive and cost-effective environment. But we do have to crunch the numbers, and the equation's got to be really thought through very carefully. So just to really summarise that, intuitively, I think most of us really see that a continuous build would be a good thing to do. And when we look around the world, most people are attempting to do that also. So there's a corroboration to that intuition.
Thank you. I'm going to invoke Chairman's privilege at this point and ask John a question. John, given the timings of Australia's submarine project, we need new boats that have been designed, constructed, sea trials, entering service around 2030, thereabouts. So 16, 17 years. How manageable do you think that is given our current skills situation? And do we actually have enough time to get the skills up to where they need to be to deliver a program on that timescale?
Yeah. Normally, as I showed my charts, it takes about 15 years from start until you can get a boat in the water with a fully proficient workforce. And so if that's the schedule and you've got about 17 years to get the first boat in the water, you're clearly probably going to need some external help and a partner.
Yeah. Okay. Brendan Nicholson.
Thanks very much. Brendan Nicholson from the Australian newspaper. Mr. Birkler mentioned the, I think I'm getting this right, just a line in your dissertation about the Second World War when American, in particular, manufacturing managed to outpace that of the Axis forces. Is that an accurate?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, your comment. Yeah, I'm sorry. Now, yesterday we had Andrew explaining, and again I might have the wrong person here, what it would be, what a submarine would confront going through shallow areas in terms of sensors and other equipment that would make it extremely difficult for a submarine to remain invisible, basically. Has something changed over the last 60-odd years where mass-producing equipment isn't actually going to win a war, that in fact you've got to be particularly sophisticated? Like Admiral Grigg said yesterday, that he wasn't too concerned about how many submarines we had as long as they were the right ones. How important is it to get a technological edge in all of this equipment over numbers?
I will tell you that I believe the answer is yes. You need both. You need to have the sophistication that is consistent with the challenges that we see today. But you also have to have the numbers, at least for the U.S. Navy, the issues of presence, the issues of having adequate resources to cover all the AORs, the areas of responsibility that we worry about, is an equal challenge. And the problem that we have, quite frankly, is that within an era of budgetary challenges and constraints, what's the right balance? One needs to be able to have the capabilities and the qualities that will enable us to both deter and defend, if necessary, against near-peer adversaries, at the same time that we have the quantities necessary to deal across the globe. And that's a balancing act. It's neither one nor the other. It really requires a continued reassessment of what is the right optimum mix. We try to adjust things like our presence in different areas, the shift to the Pacific, which quite frankly began many years ago when we reallocated our carrier force accordingly, is an attempt to be able to do that. And all that said, we still have challenges in the Middle East, in the Gulf of Guinea, off the coast of Somalia that we have to be able to deal with. How do you work the simultaneous solution of what really are competing priorities and agendas is a critical aspect of the overall planning process, and it's not one that can be solved simply.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? Noting yesterday we heard consistently that Australia's searching for a regionally superior submarine and that we have great desire to leverage off USN systems. How sustainable do you think the qualitative edge that the West has enjoyed in the last few decades is?
I would say that it depends upon our continued attention to the problem and a recognition that it is a continuing process. I'll go back to what I said, you know, one of my favorite advisors, fortunately no longer with us, Wayne Myers, who really believed in the evolutionary approach, not just evolutionary once every 20 years, but on a continuing evolutionary basis. As one goes and operates, one learns a lot about what is providing value and what is not. One understands where enhancements and improvements need to be made, and one also can take a look at the ongoing development of technology and the opportunities for the insertion of that technology to continue those enhancements. It's not either or. You are going to have major block changes where we make significant enhancements. We're doing that with the Ford-class carrier right now. You can't do all of those changes every individual carrier. But there are, in between those major class changes, incremental improvements. Anytime that we just assume we're safe and that everything is going to be taken care of, I think we're exposing ourselves to great risk.
Okay, thank you. Rod Lyon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of the panellists. They all had interesting things to say. But as a non-physicist, I'm trying to grapple with some conclusions here. Steve Ludlam says there's nothing in the law of physics that stops us building submarines in Australia. Mark Thomson says that's true, but we're going to run out of money. John Birkler says it's true, but we don't have the skill sets at the moment. And Don Winter says it's true, but expect to trip over your own feet on any complex program. I used to think philosophers were an unruly discipline, but I'm prepared to cede that position now to physicists. So if I can put it as a blunt, simple
Natural philosophers is the term you're looking for, Rod.
If I can put it as a simple question, am I right to conclude from this panel that Australia can build its own submarine as long as it's prepared to devote the resources and the skill sets and the management tasks and do them properly?
Well, look, I'll first of all, I'm only a half full-time equivalent physicist, by the way. I started life as a mechanical engineer, then became a nuclear engineer, so I'm not quite as eloquent as the rest of the panel in this issue, but I think it would be right to conclude that Australia can do this, that we can do this. I think it would be wrong to conclude it in a way that says it's easy. I think there's an enormous challenge. I think leadership will be a significant part of that challenge. I think the challenge rests in bringing the design capability together, understanding clearly the risks, managing through the risks using prototyping and various other methods like that, actually setting out a production run that's worthwhile doing, and making this a national campaign, but not a campaign that we just throw dollars at. I think that would be wrong. A campaign that actually produces a very competitive, on an international basis, very competitive industry for shipbuilding. And I think I'd probably make those same comments on surface ships as I would on submarines. So yeah, we could do this, but it's a big challenge, but we should get on with it.
Yeah.
I won't speculate on what's possible or not possible, but let me try and say something constructive about how to maximise the possibility of success. I think we've seen, certainly yesterday and today, we've heard about the necessity to have great attention to detail about what we want our submarines to do and what sort of performance characteristics they should have. I think everyone agrees with that. And we've also heard about the need to do our engineering right, to just, measure twice, cut once. Basic stuff about going through and being thorough, about following the disciplines of systems engineering, so on and so forth. And I defer to the expertise of the people who've made those points, but I've got no doubt that they are rock solid and true. But just as important to the success of the program will be the economic relationships between the parties in the program, between the government and defence, between defence and DMO, between DMO and the project office itself, and between DMO and the counterparties in that contractual arrangement. I guess what I'm suggesting is that the same sort of ruthless attention to detail and discipline needs to be applied to shaping and refining those contractual arrangements, those relationships between parties, to ensure that the incentives are aligned, to assure that risk is being managed by the parties best able to manage the risk, that the fact that the Commonwealth at the end of the day is going to be the one that carries the can if things go pear-shaped, are all taken into account to, in effect, design a procurement strategy which gives us the very, very best chance of success. Now, let me say some things that probably people don't want to hear. We can't design a strategy like that simply by listening to industry. Industry has a dog in the fight. Industry has a vested interest and it has shareholders and it wants to get profits. Fine, that's their job, but we need to listen to them, but they can't be the exclusive source of information. Similarly, Defence has a dog in a fight. Defence, through DMO, will be a counterparty to these contracts, and Defence is in a privileged position, in effect, as the regulator of the industries which it is a customer for. And what might make it a nice, sorry Warren, a nice day at the office for Defence or DMO might not necessarily be the most efficient arrangement from the taxpayer's perspective. So what I'm suggesting here is that just as we're looking around the world for the best information on skills, on systems engineering, on submarine technologies, I think we need to make sure in the next stage of this project when we move forward that we get the very best advice we can from independent third parties about structuring a contractual arrangement that will probably be in place for at least 15 years and maybe in perpetuity, that ensures that we've got the best chance of delivering and delivering at an affordable cost.
All right, well, we're almost out of time. Got time for one more question. Does anything from the floor? Because I have one more question. Well,
one in the back.
Oh, one in the back? Sorry, didn't see that.
Commodore Martin Brooker, Military Strategy and Department of Defence. Thank you, panel, for your presentations. I guess there were a couple of different views from Mark and Stephen, and in reality you were probably presenting the other sides of each other's arguments, and I guess highlighting some of the risks. I guess with the complex issue that we have ahead of us, the public debate is necessary, but it won't necessarily lead to the solution to Mark's questions. I guess I'm interested in your views of who you think needs to lead this, what alternative strategies there are, and what, if any, expectations you have of the white paper FSR process in answering some of those questions.
That's not for me.
Do you want to lead off, Mark?
It's a big question, ranging from the submarine project through to the white paper. I'll just make 2 points. I was very careful in the comments I made about the arrangements. I don't pretend to have the answer. I don't know what the best optimum contracting strategy would be, but I sure as hell know it's a problem that we need to put our heads together and get some advice on and sort through. So I can't say who or in what way things should be headed. In terms of the force structure review, let me just say that I would be surprised if there was a dramatic change from the sort of priorities we saw emerge from the 2009 and 2013 white paper. The trends that underpin 2009 and 2013 have, if anything, only strengthened. The FSR will be done by the department, and the same people, in effect, will be doing it under the same internal and other pressures. So my expectation would be, in terms of the priority for the submarines, continuity going forward.
I'll say that the white paper will be a thing of beauty. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we'd all agree that this has been a very information-rich session that we've had today, and we've got a very distinguished panel here with a wide variety of experience. I've certainly benefited from the discussion, and I trust that you have too. And if we could just put our hands together and thank our panel.